Hello, hello, hello. I'm sure by now you're used to my voice. It's your boy, Sean Flores, with the Flower Hour podcast. Today, I am joined by Rufai, an artist and a mental health researcher. And if any of you could see what Kai looks like right now on camera, he's a man that is sure in his masculinity and his manhood. Why? Because he's wearing pink. Quite often, we don't
Yes.
see men wear pink, and he's wearing light blue. This tells me this is already about to be a bright and a vibrant and an enlightening conversation. Kai, how are you doing today, my brother? And I'm so thankful and happy to have you on.
Thank you, Sean, man. And it is K, just to go back to that one on that. But I'm really honored to be here. You know, it's been a long time coming. We've been talking about trying to make this happen for quite a while. So I'm very thankful that we finally allowed it to align today. And I feel excited to be on this platform, bro.
No, most definitely. I saw the fantastic work that you were doing, and it deeply intrigued me simply by your color scheme. And as I said, it
Mm,
shouldn't even be something that's an issue, but we know with gender
mm,
roles and gender stereotypes.
mm-hmm.
I remember when I was younger and I dared to wear a pink shirt, and pink looks quite good on my skin tone. Tell a lie, because I'm because
Bro,
because
jeez.
because I'm a little lighty, like I'm a browning, as
Right,
people would call me.
right,
That's good. And
right.
I remember my mom said, "You best take that off right now. You're looking like a faggot."
Bro.
I'll never forget. And that's
Wow.
because, not to disrespect my mom, but she came from a
Mm,
culture where it's deeply homophobic. Caribbean
mm-hmm,
culture in some aspects is like that. But in a more positive light, they're moving on and things are
mm-hmm.
becoming better for people. And there's a lot less gender stereotypes and roles. So I saw the fantastic work you did, and I had to come and reach out to you. I had to give you the chance and the opportunity to come and tell your story. So, how are you? And most importantly, who are you? I always ask this to people, who are you?
Right. I mean, thank you so much for firstly just sharing your own honest experiences around, yeah, the battles of patriarchy and homophobia and how those things interplay in the ways in which we raise, for sure, because I have similar stories in that regard. But I guess at some point we can uncover that. But the question, I guess, who am I? You know, it's a minefield in terms of trying to navigate that. I think I am still trying to figure that out. I do know who it is that I am not, and I do start off by perhaps trying to quantify who I am by highlighting who I'm not. And I think who I'm not is a man that is confined by the patriarchal structures and the patriarchal norms that have been socialized into me from a very young age. I'm an African, first generation British that was raised in three continents. I was born in England, and at the age of 3, I moved to Nigeria, where my mom and father is from. At the age of 8, I moved to California, and then I moved back to the UK. So I didn't grow up around my father, and I grew up, with numerous extended families. So I guess in that context, being heavily influenced by the African culture, wherever it is that I was growing up in, the African culture still held a strong hold on me in terms of family values, traditional ideas, and culture. So all these things, as you highlighted, are deeply steeped in ideas of what masculinity is predefined to be, which again is predicated upon the ideas of patriarchy, and ultimately is the concepts of homophobia seep into that. So ideas of who I should have been, which is, a Black male who aspires to put food on a table because I'm the man and I should have a job that is either, medicine, engineering, law, or pharmacy. Those are, I guess, the 4 options for African child like myself. And then being this creative child who inherently I'm quite expressive, and growing up in that environment where everything was the opposite of that. It was suppressive. I needed to be a particular version of what my mom and my aunties would have been proud of. And growing up in environments where, again, as a young Black boy, the yearn for male uh, role model was inevitably pertinent in the ways in which I socialized, because I didn't have a father figure around. So ultimately what that led to was me kind of circumventing what a pathway that looked like from my mother's perspective was a positive pathway to, I guess, feeling like I needed to know who I was as a young Black male. And ultimately the ideas that were shown to me of what a young Black male was on these different continents, especially in America, was one that was heavily manufactured by the capitalist system. This ideas of what Black masculinity should be: hyper machismo, really emotionless, really very dark tone in the aesthetic expressions, not shy of, getting involved in confrontation and fights. All these ideas that were, portrayed either through music, through movies, through aesthetics that were continually exposed to me as a young Black male. That's what I thought I was at the time. And what that meant for me was, I was easily kind of drawn into those types of ideas of masculinity and, being around people who were involved in violence, involved in drug activities. I thought that was a trajectory that was meant for me because there wasn't any other counter stereotypical ideas of what masculinity should be until I came across, Lauryn Hill, the Miseducation Lauryn Hill album. I think that was the beginning of my own learning, understanding what love meant, understanding what ideas of identity meant, hearing these little young kids talk about love in a classroom setting, and just hearing those conversations being navigated through in that album interlude was just a beautiful thing. And then I discovered art. I discovered Tupac, and I understood this complexity of masculinities, these huge spectrums of expressions that he ultimately explored through his music. One side he had this hyper gangster outlook, but then on the other side, he explored this myriad of emotions, through various elements, the love he has for his mother, the love for himself, understanding identity. So anyway, so all these things allowed me to start to shave off all these ideas that I thought were predestined for me as a Black male. And through that journey, which is still ongoing at the moment, I am slowly trying to uncover who I really am, which is the person who is very expressive, who loves to show how he feels on the outside through my aesthetic representation. I'm such a colorful individual inside of my mind. And it was a disservice for me to not represent that outwardly. And ultimately for me coming close to that version of myself through, being, disowned at certain points by my mother for similar reasons like you, because any single thing I did, she was like, people are going to think you're gay, man. Like, what's that about? And I'm like, well, let's go back to the bottom. Why is the idea of being gay something that we should look upon as the worst possible, verdict as a male, and then, my mom being heavily Christian and, a huge kind of figure in the church, those conversations were not being, I guess, what's the word? When they were not encouraged, were they engaged in, in a very open manner. So ultimately, that brought a lot of friction and just really just trying to find who I was by ultimately bucking against what I was supposed to be based on tradition, culture, and religion. And that's where I am right now. And ultimately, I guess that's why I do the work that I do with young boys, particularly because I know that's what I needed when I was their age. And as a 37-year-old man now, being in a position where I'm just uncovering some of these things, I feel like it's important for me to definitely be trying to encourage and empower young boys at a much younger age to be able to explore and get to these points in their lives.
That sounds like a journey that I couldn't even fathom the shoes you would have to wear to cover those miles. Wow. The parallels I can draw to my journey, it's absolutely crazy. I've said this before on one of my episodes that one of my friends, when I had long hair and he had long hair, so we both took our hair out for each other and I didn't think anything of it. I was just like, boys being boys, that we're helping out each other. I remember my mum came down the stairs and she gave me that look as if to say, like, what are you two doing? And I remember when my friend left, my mum said, you two looked like a bunch of gays. And I'm like, for taking each other's hair out. I'm like, are you really being that serious? Is my masculinity and my manhood predetermined by the fact I'm taking out my boy's hair? I'm like, really? Like, how reductive and how regressive that statement is. However, I had to understand it from my mother's perspective. She grew up in that kind of culture. She could not see it in any kind of way. And you know what I aligned with deeply when you said men wearing tone deaf colors, you're right. Like this hoodie, if anyone could see it, it's fluorescent. And it's probably one of the brightest items I've ever worn in my life. And I think it's quite reflective of my personality. Some people would say I'm quite monotone, but then other people would say I express a myriad of emotions the same way you said Tupac does. Because I'm different people around different people, and I can already feel the warmth and the energy you've brought to the conversation, and I'm feeling positive and upbeat. So that says a lot about, you said you're colorful in mind, but clearly you're colorful in the energy and the vibration that you're pushing out. So you've already made me a fan, right?
That's great.
Take me through that journey in terms of when you had your mum telling you all this sort of stuff, saying to you, people are going to think you're gay. Did that ever make you question your sexuality?
I mean, that's a really fantastic question, because even those statements still come today. Like I remember, like I think this summer, I pierced my nose. And my mom was not having it. Like, I'm a grown man. I don't live with my mom, nothing like that. But I remember it was a whole conversation. We had like an hour after I'd done it. She's like, man, like I just don't. If I see you, I'm gonna cross the road. Like, I just think it's just gay. And I'm just like, so I guess that conversation has always inherently been there, in terms of my mom always just resorting to anything that I wore that was remotely unmasculine in her definitions, which is anything that was not sort of, again, just monotone colors and just very muted colors. Then she'd be like, that's kind of gay. People are going to think you're gay and all that stuff. And, sometimes for a long time, I never engaged in the conversation, but I knew it had an impact on me, because it made me question what it is that, because in my head, for a long time, I'd always felt like I was secure in my sexuality and knowing that I was a heterosexual male. But ultimately knowing that my expression is not connected to my sexuality, that I could choose to express however I want to express. And it should not be in any way to me, because I know those two never were at odds. The fact that I was a heterosexual male never made me feel like, okay, because of that, then I shouldn't wear this, or I shouldn't speak like this, or I shouldn't do this. I just felt like I knew that I needed to be true to who I was. And ultimately, whatever anybody else's perception of that is irrelevant to me, should be irrelevant to me. But I knew that because, our mother's love has always been a huge part of everything, in terms of, especially in the void of a male figure in the household. And then looking at, understanding, the more I started to understand things and read a lot, one of the huge authors that really allowed me to understand this at a greater depth is Bell Hooks.
I was about to say, Bell Hooks,
yes,
my favorite
absolutely.
author of all
Boy,
time.
me and you, Sean, absolutely.
God.
She just breaks it down in ways that just like they just blow my mind.
Do you know what's
what's
crazy, right? She's hated now by third wave feminists simply because she addresses certain points within masculinity and manhood and motherhood and single parenthood that we're afraid to have. So when you said that to me, I'm looking to my left and I've got all her books, man. I've even got her children's books.
Wow, that's incredible.
Has deeply influenced my very existence.
Boy, that's so incredible to connect with somebody else that has such great reverence for Bell Hooks in that manner, because for me, she absolutely changed my life, just really uncovering, one of the things that really resonate with me strongly is something that she spoke about, the indoctrination of young boys into patriarchy through the concept of shame. And ultimately, when I read that, it just blew my mind, because I was like, wow, that's what happened. That's what my mother was doing all this time. It was just inflicting this concept of shame on me, that I would always remember that. So I would always go in the direction that allowed me not to experience that shame that she and all the other women around projected on me from a very young age when I did something that ultimately was very counter masculine in their ideas. They came to me straight away and said, what is that, boy? Are you gay? Or is that, people going to think you're gay, or you're man up, or you're sissy, all these things, And ultimately, those things served as a reminder that I should never, ever allow myself to experience those levels of shame anymore. And ultimately, as an adult, when I started to kind of, I guess, engage in these conversations with my mom, I realized that one of the biggest things I needed to do was to disarm myself from this feeling of shame that was inherently holding me back from being who I authentically wanted to be, because I felt like either my mother was going to be ashamed of me, or, this was going to bring shame on me by other male peers in the society and other women ultimately as well. And I realized, one of the biggest liberations that I could, empower myself with was to be liberated from other people's perspectives of me, which ultimately would remove this idea of feeling shameful. Because it doesn't matter to me if I do a lot of work in the prison, and I go into the prison like this. Damn. And you can imagine what happens when I'm walking down a wing and people are like, oh, who's that faggot, bro? Who's that gay guy, man? Get out of here, bro. You're moist, you're wet, all of these. And I ultimately, then when they come into the sessions, and I start to curate conversations and allow for them to explore these things, all of a sudden these guys are breaking down in tears. But ultimately, for me, knowing that I didn't have to come in there seeking their validation as a man, because I know that ultimately my aesthetic presence challenges everything they know, and everything that's led them to the prison in itself is what I am challenging by walking into the prison in pink. Because ultimately some of these guys are in there for GBH, for ABH, all these things that resort from these concepts of being told that you have to be this idea of a man. So if somebody challenges you and tries to violate you or calls you wet or moist, you're sparking, bro. Or you go back, pull the thing, and then get the situation sorted out, and then you're in here riding the bird for 15. So it's crazy, and it's so interesting seeing how all these things have led the versions of masculinities that most of us have decided to, or have been, I guess, imprisoned to live within, leading us down to very detrimental states in our lives, and ultimately in the states of our existence as a society as well.
You know how powerful it is when you said that you had to free yourself of shame by living by certain people's opinions. And I say this to people, if you live for other people's opinions, you die by their approval. I always say this to people, bro. Right? And it's so powerful when you would walk into wherever you are in your clothes, free from the shame, and you show people who you are. That is powerful within itself. And the smile that goes through my face and through my body tells me that you're a man. You live for yourself and you die by only your own opinion and your own approval. That is incredible. People do not realize, and I've said this to people, for example, right? I don't like to dress up all the time. I find it a bit long to dress up. So when I do dress up and I want to look good, some of my friends are always like, oh, bro, dress up a little bit more. I said, who am I doing it for? Am I doing it for your approval, or am I doing it for me? I said, I can slap on bin bags and I can still feel as confident as I want to be compared to when I'm in a suit. And you're right? Clothes are our second skin. We know clothes are the greatest expression of us. And typically we have racialized clothing typically when it comes to black boys, right? The hoodies,
absolutely.
The tracksuits. But nowadays, what is lingerie to women is the gray sweatpants, the gray hoodie, the white shirt, the fresh strip, and a few piercings and tattoos. That in itself. So it really makes you sit down and think about the world in which we're living in, right?
Absolutely.
So when you and I have found that reference of bell hooks, you're right. Bell hooks' work was emancipatory for me. It was liberating for me. It made me sit down and realize, hold up, I'm secure enough in who I am. But then, truthfully, I've questioned myself on the back of other people's opinions. So I've modeled back in the day a bit more. I did fashion modeling, right? I've worn dresses. I've had my lips done in terms of they've put lipstick on. I've had makeup on. I never questioned myself. Until I was questioned about who I was. So I used to have messages like, Sean, bro, like, are you gay? Like, why go on? Like, Sean, are you bisexual? And it started to compound. The interest started to build on me. That seed was being put into the soil, and I started unknowingly watering in it. I started to water it, right? And then I remember fashion is a really interesting conversation in itself, because I do think in some aspects there is an over feminization of black men. And why I argue that is because some people say there's nothing more powerful in society than a heterosexual black man who loves a black woman. How do you feel about that statement? And how do you feel about perhaps the over feminization of black men within the fashion industry itself?
Wow, that's massively deep. I think there's multiple layers to this. I think for me, we have to look at the way the society is set up and has been set up for a long time. When we think about the intersection, I mean, as Bell Hooks puts it, the white supremacist, the imperialist white supremacist, capitalist patriarchal system, and looking at how these systems all intersect, and then looking at, for example, the visual imagery that have, for the most of my young to semi-adult life, that have been completely monetized, have been the image of a black male that is completely physically dominant, aggressive, dangerous, and for the most part, a gangster, a thug, and this guy that is worth being scared of. That's the visual imagery of black masculinity that has, for the most part, yielded the most commercial success, the most monetary gains. So therefore, when we understand that media, music, fashion have really profited from that visual imagery of black male, then with the growing movement of feminism, the growing movement of LGBTQ rights. I think that then being intersected with the I guess almost radical shift in the visual imagery, especially within the fashion industry, that was then kind of, I guess, more visually present in terms of now more, I guess, as you said, brighter colors, more androgynous visualization of masculinities, and especially when you think about Black male, which again, when you put that against what had previously been existing, it's a stark contrast. So therefore, I can imagine why that argument of the increased effeminization of the black body, which ultimately makes a lot of people then think that there's an agenda behind that. For me personally, I don't know if I believe that's an actual agenda, but I do believe that there was I guess maybe a shift in the actual casting culture. There was a shift in the ideas that were presented to those who were in the advertising industries in terms of what they wanted to start to represent more. And ultimately, again, you cannot take that away from the powers that be, that this was also a conscious idea to that in terms of what they wanted to shift the products and the visual consciousness of people to us. But for me, I don't personally think, because again, if I was to agree with that idea, then I would believe that the concept of the myriad of masculinities that we should have the freedom to express, there is something inherently insidiously negative about that. And ultimately, for me, I don't believe that, because I do believe, again, I've gone and spent years, not years actually, a few years ago, I went and spent 6 weeks in Ethiopia with some indigenous tribes. And ultimately, the visuals that were hit to me about what the ideas of masculinity is and has been in particular environments was so challenging, because I was in those environments seeing men, with visual adornments that I've always associated with femininity, men with face paints, men who were grooming each other, who were, helping each other paint their bodies, grooming their private parts, all in the open. So I was in villages where the men were walking around naked, women were walking around naked, men were holding hands. So all these ideas of the expression of self that, again, is completely removed from the concept of social media, internet, electricity. In these villages, they never had any of these things. And then seeing these representations of masculine identities was so mind-blowing to me, because all these things that I was looking at, I was like, on paper, these things are deemed effeminate from the Western ideas that I have about masculinity. But being in these environments, seeing these freedom of men to express themselves in ways that are completely just authentic to who they are, but not being defined by what that should mean or what that shouldn't mean. So for me, I guess that really was a very incredibly eye-opening experience for me to really challenge what I have always known masculinity to be. So therefore, coming back to your question, I don't necessarily believe that there is an agenda to continually make men more effeminate. And actually, for me, if that is an agenda, I would see it as a balance to what had already existed, which was more detrimental in terms of, because if people say, the union of Black male and Black female, is one of the most powerful existence in our time, but actually looking at the visual aesthetics that had prevailed before that, that also served to destroy the union, because more men were going into prison, more men were committing more physical and homicidal engagements through violence, through other elements, through domestic violence, because of the visual imagery that had been purported to us as how we should always see ourselves. So ultimately, what that was doing was also separating the Black family, because the Black man was going more to prison than any other, ethnic minority in the States. Again, the Black man was more likely to be involved in things that engaged in him being killed or at least maimed in some way. So therefore, those visuals that existed prior to this so-called effeminization of the male body also didn't serve the Black family anyway. So ultimately, for me, I don't have any strong reasons to believe that was a direct agenda, but I do believe that, you know, that was a consciousness to shift the visual imagery. And ultimately, we know that wherever there's a consciousness to do something like that, there is a capitalization from a monetary perspective from the powers that be. And ultimately, we cannot not address that in that conversation as well.
I think that has been one of the most holistic, wholesome answers I have ever received. It's really made me sit down and think, because in many aspects, you're absolutely right. Whatever representation we've had as black males, it's been monetized, right? So, for example, you saw recently Candace Owens was really angry at Harry Styles for wearing a dress, right? And I'll use an example of an item. Back in the day, people forgot heels were worn by kings who were short to reach, you know, the correct height next to a woman. People don't realize that. But because men stopped being, you know, as short and there wasn't much money, they marketed it towards women. That is a really interesting conversation. And it's very, we think about gendered items. But whenever we think about the monetization, that has really made me think that regardless what black people wear, there's money to be made in it. And we know there's also been a sexual voracity and an appetite from populations outside of the black community and even within the black community to have that thug, to have that predator, that hypersexualized black male. And listen, I've got to be honest with you. In many aspects, I have enjoyed, you know, being seen like that because it feeds into my ego, right? But the one thing I've learned that by being woke, I didn't free my ego to become, or is it I didn't free my soul to become a slave to my ego. So there's still things I'm absolutely unlearning. But when you see, so I'm sure you've realized this in yourself. You're a good looking man. You're expressive, right? Yeah. I'm sure before you went on this journey, you know, you go out and you might act in a certain kind of way that is toxically masculine in many aspects in terms of the boundaries and the binaries in which we lock ourselves in, not operate outside of. You get that positive reinforcement from females out there. Absolutely. Like, no matter what, you get that positive reinforcement. Like, I remember in terms of when you're more aggressive, you're more assertive, you're more competitive, women look at you twice. And perhaps evolutionary aspect, perhaps that is, but there's also that positive reinforcement, and there becomes that positive loop in which it becomes so hard for men to come out of that circle. So I've got to ask you, you know, you've got these men in society that they've gone to prison and they've probably been positively rewarded for practicing dangerous and detrimental and bewildering acts of masculinity in the name of feeding their ego or perhaps meeting their financial needs. How do you say to a black man, listen, bro, there's no need for you to do that, when all the badders on the blocks, they want to free it up for him? How do you get him to stop that when it's literally all around him? And that probably even plays into the idea of sexual addiction. So I'd love to know, how do you get those men to stop that?
Bro, I mean, you hit the nail on the head in so many precise ways. It's incredible. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, you know, trying to tell a young boy or even a grown man, you know, about how a counter stereotypical idea of representation of masculinities could serve him best, when everything that, as you highlighted, that is around him reinforces only one type of masculinity in a positive way. You know, the guy who's on the block, who's pushing, I don't know, Lamborghini Jeep, you know, and everybody know he's getting his money from trap. You know, everybody knows he's getting his money from the bando. That guy is the guy that all the girls are out there trying to, you know, DM him on a regular basis. They're trying to jump in his whip, all of that. You're trying to get this guy to be somebody else when he can only see one outcome for that version. He becomes a target on the road because people are probably going to try and G-check him more because they think he's wet, he's moist. You're going to be, you know, less appealing to women because women are going to think, oh, you're soft anyway. You know, I want some other guy who's more tough. So that's one of the biggest challenges that exists, because everything that, you know, reinforces a reward system for a particular version of masculinity is not pointing in the direction of this more expressive, more emotionally literate, this counter stereotypical idea of toxic masculinity that exists. So therefore, trying to convince somebody that it's worth shedding all of these shackles that the society has been, you know, reinforcing within them is one of the biggest tasks. And for me, one of the things that I use as a hook point is really dissecting the structures, because especially when I'm working with young Black boys, particularly, say, you know, I work a lot with a lot of 13-year-olds, because I think in terms of evidence of research, that age 13 is one of the most impactful ages to make an intervention, because of the cognitive stage of their development, where they are not completely formed in their identity to resist new ideas, but they are not too young where their cognitive abilities is still quite premature. So they are at such an interesting cusp where they could take in new theories and actually start to implement that in their own self and their own identity. So engaging with these young boys, I start to ask them this concept of, and I use a lot of evocative tools. And as an artist, that's one of the most powerful things that I find, in that, you know, just showing them various images and getting them to respond and react to these images. So I have an image that I shot of two young boys in Ethiopia, where I was just walking down in this village, and these young boys saw me, and all of a sudden they just embraced each other, like saying, take a picture of us. And the embrace was such a beautifully pure embrace, where their faces were touching, and they were just holding each other so tight. And I show that image to these young boys. And, you know, I work in environments like, you know, Hackney, Peckham, Camberwell, Tottenham. And these young boys, the first thing they say, bro, that's first thing I ask them when I see this image, like, what do you feel when you look at this? And they say, oh, you know, I feel like it's loving, it's brotherhood, it's, you know, they're really tight. And then I ask them, would you take a picture with your friend like this? They said, no, fam, that's gay, man. Why would I do that? That's moist, that's wet, that's this, that's that. And I'm like, that's interesting, because the first response you said when I told you, what do you feel about this image, was one that was filled with joy, positivity, togetherness, love, all of these things. And all of a sudden I'm asking you, do you not love your friend? Do you not feel this feeling of brotherhood and togetherness? They'd be like, yeah, I do, but I just spud my guy. That's cool. That's all I do. I don't need to be touching his face with him, bro. That's gay. And all of a sudden, I start to deconstruct. Okay, so let's look at, you know, what the trajectory of a regular kid that's come from your environment is, for the most part, in terms of what you see, what you hear on the music that you listen to. Especially this generation, they listen a lot to drill, you know, and a lot of the ideas of masculinity that's purported on these in this particular genre of music that is predominantly created by Black folks, is ultimately this hyper toxic, you know, violence inducing energy, which ultimately, when we look at the trajectory of a lot of these young people, we deconstruct that. We think, okay, yes, you think they have all the bad bees. Okay, that's questionable, because a lot of these young people, a lot of these people feel very difficult. They find it difficult to trust these women, because they potentially don't believe these women are into them because of who they are, or who they are in their own person. Ultimately, they feel like it's the trappings that come with their image and their status. So therefore, a lot of these men are more paranoid. A lot of these men are more likely to engage in violent acts towards these women because of excessive distrust. These men are more likely to be more controlling and more, more controlling is the word. And then again, looking at the violence that comes out of the music that they create, and the life that they've lived prior to the music. And ultimately looking at all these markers that, yes, we look at the money they have, when you look at this status of the fact that they say they have girls and they get girls, but ultimately, is that the type of girl you would want? A girl who only is into you because of your status, who's only into you because you are quick to fight on her behalf for another guy, when you can look at an alternative way to engage in discourse with somebody who potentially might be disrespectful to her, as opposed to just I don't know, sparking him and punching him and whatever it is that you might believe is the way to be a man in that scenario. So getting them to really look at that and think about, actually, the prison is 97% male and 3% female. Is that coincidence? I asked the question. And ultimately, they were like, well, not really, no. Okay, so why is that the prison system is completely overwhelmingly skewed towards the male identity, right? Yes. So therefore, looking at that and thinking, again, when we look into that and think, especially in the UK, looking at the fact that we only make up 3% of the population, but over 46% of the prison population is Black and minority ethnic. So looking at that and thinking, these are not a coincidence. When we look at the ways in which we have been programmed and socialized to exist as men, it inevitably takes us down in one outcome. Again, when I look at the disproportionality of the Black male to be detained by the Mental Health Act, 4 times more likely than any other race. When we look at who's more likely to take their lives by suicide, the Black male also represents that particular statistic overwhelmingly. So when we start to deconstruct these things, we realize that actually the ideas of masculinity that we have been sold does not profit us in the long term. We might look at these little trappings as, oh, that's a reward. Yeah, he's got the car, he's got the girls, he's got that. But actually in the long term, you know, there's all these mental health issues of paranoia, schizophrenia, all these other things that again exist within these communities of these men that we look at and herald as the success of toxic masculinities. And again, you know, we cannot remove the outcomes or the I guess the hooks of capitalism in this, because ultimately, you know, looking at what most of these young people and most of us potentially come from environments where, you know, we weren't handed no, you know, trust fund or nothing like that. So most people see the idea of getting out the hood as a win. So whatever, by any means necessary, somebody who came from the same block as me, he was trapping, he's now rapping, he's come out, he's bought his mama mansion. How can you tell me that that's not the legit route that equals the success of being how he was, which is being tough, being a criminal, being a gangster, and now he's made it. But ultimately, trying to help them peel back these facades and actually look at a lot of the underlying issues that surround this ideas of masculinity. So for me, that's one of the biggest pieces of work that I do, especially when I work with this demographic of 13-year-old boys, but also when I'm in prison. I think that's a really interesting conversation, because a lot of these young people, you know, prison is a rites of passage for most of them. You know, they've had to use that as an opportunity to show, actually, I'm not the boy anymore. Now I can put this in a you know, I could, you know, put this amount of money for my Marge now. She don't have to worry about this. Or, you know, this guy was taking my lunch money when I was in year 7, and he came back around when I was in year 10, thought he was going to try and move to me like that. I had to show him that I ain't a waste man no more. And all, yeah, exactly. But you're in a prison cell. You're riding a 7-year bird. So who's a punk right now? You know, I mean, let's deep that, you know, because at the end of the day, you did all these things for people out there and you think you have this reputation, but these guys ain't coming to check for you out here. You know, the visiting day is filled with your mom with tears and your baby mother. You know, those are the people that are actually dealing with the consequences of this rite of passage of masculinity. So actually, let's deep that. And all of a sudden, you know, I see tears coming out their eyes. And all of a sudden, they are allowing this side of themselves, this vulnerability to come out, because, you know, they have these emotional cords that are tied to the people that they genuinely love, who they've always suppressed these feelings within them, because they thought actually the ways of actually gaining the respect of these people is by being this version of myself. And then actually after seeing the consequences of that, they realize that this daughter that they have, that they think, you know, putting aside 50K is going to be good for her. But this daughter only just wants her dad to be there to take her to school. So no matter how much you think you've put to the side that you're nice, when you come out, your daughter don't need that. She don't want that from you. She just wants her dad in the physical form. You can't give her that. And ultimately, they start to break down and realize this. And ultimately, that's what I think for me is the hook that I use to empower these young men to start to, you know, unshackle themselves from these refrains of masculinity that has been sold to all of us, you know, for the longest.
Damn, bro. You know, when you hear someone say that, the daughter just wants her dad to be there, it makes me feel emotional, because a man thinks he's doing what's right and the daughter just wants her dad around. Like, that is emotional. When you think about how emotive that is, that makes me want to cry. And I'm not one of those men who are afraid to show how I feel. Like, I'll cry fully right now, and that's not my
that's issue. Amazing.
And we know that in the UK prison population that there's more Afro-Caribbean, there's more black people essentially in percentages compared to America. And we know that in the UK. The last time I checked statistics, I think it was in 2008 or 2018, that there were over 13 private prisons. So we also know that there's a monetary factor in terms of why more black boys are put into prison. And the fact you said it's a rite of passage, that in itself is absolutely crazy, because I've spoken with the Manhood Academy, which I'm maybe sure that you're familiar with their work.
I know.
And they believe
for sure
in the rite of passage in terms of inducting boys into manhood or masculinity. So when the fact we think about prison as a transition, that rite of passage into manhood, to then realize, hold up, there's something wrong with my issues. Now, we also know as well that boys are more prone to being aggressive. We're more prone to being competitive. We know that femininity, women are emotionally a bit more mature than men. We know that, you know, maturation with boys can be put off. Boys can put off being mature for years. We can do it, simply because there's not really a biological incentive in many aspects for us to have to do that. So it's quite hard for a lot of boys. We're raising a lot of broken boys into broken men. And as much as I hate that term broken, and I've said that before, sometimes if the shoe fits, it fits, right? So the fact we hear everything you said, I'm hearing that loud and clear. And that's registering with me, because I grew up in a single parent family, right? My mom, fantastic mother, but I've said this before and I'll say it again. I needed my dad. My dad died. You know, he
Right.
died when I
Right.
was 6 on Christmas Day, and I missed him to death. But
Sorry
I
to hear
never
that, bro.
realized it until I got older. I never reckoned
Mm,
with parental
right.
bereavement, and I'm hoping to
Right.
in 2021 be able to give a TEDx talk on that, so I can inspire other
Bro,
young
that would
boys.
be
Like,
so powerful,
even if
man.
your dad is not in your life, that's bereavement, man. Like, you're
Right.
suffering. That's
Right.
grief. That's shock.
Bro, just to say, sorry to interject, just last week, it's one of the questions that I asked these young people, because the program I deliver that I designed is based upon an 8-week pillars of happiness, and I designed that based on those independent themes. So one of the themes is togetherness and belonging. And when I explore all these things that we just spoke about, and I ask these young boys, because they say, you know what, no, men are not supposed to do that, bro. So that's moist. Why is he doing that? Why is this? And I say, okay, how many of you guys have ever heard your dad say, I love you? So in a room of 20 boys, I've ever only seen 2 hands up, ever. And that's not, that's mind blowing. Just like me, I put my hand up too, because I've never heard my dad say, I love you. So I say to them, do we think that's an accident? That you have grown up, whether your father being around or not around, even him being physically there, but has never been able, you never heard him say, I love you.
Exactly.
So therefore, that in itself is a bereavement, because emotionally, one boy was like, if my dad ever said that, I'll walk out of the room, because that's just awkward. And I'm like, even just the fact that in itself becomes something that has been taught to us as something that's awkward, just tells the whole story. So yeah, what you said is just so bang on about that.
But then it's crazy, because when you don't hear someone tell you I love you, we know words of affirmation are incredibly important. We know boys need to hear it as much as girls, and we know there's been research and literature that has shown that, for example, when boys are crying when they're children, they're left to cry, to almost suck it up.
Exactly.
To get over it. We also know as children get older and families, start to disperse, boys lose out on time with their fathers, right?
Absolutely.
You've grown up in a single parent family. Kay, can I ask you, if you don't mind sharing, what happened with your father, and just how has it impacted you with not having your own father around?
Bro, I mean, that's something I'm still uncovering today, I mean, because mine is such an interesting situation, in that my father didn't pass away. My father didn't absolutely just disappear. My father was, so my mother, at the age of, when I was 3, she decided that she didn't want to be in England because she just didn't like this country like that. She felt like she wanted to be in her homeland, where she felt more safe, where she felt more like culturally was what was, I guess, conducive for her development and her growth, and for the children that she had, which was myself and my older sister at the point. My father was like, nah, I don't really, like, we've been here, we tried, we struggled to get here, we was doing cleaning jobs. Like, now I feel like, maybe, we can try and make something out of our lives. I ain't going back. So my mom was like, okay, cool. All right, I'll go back. And then you come back every year. I come back every year. And then we'll figure out when the kids are grown. And then that was that. My mom went to Nigeria. My father was like, he just stayed over here and he just started doing his own thing. He was just like, cool. He never really turned up, So between 3 and the age of 8, I probably saw him twice, maybe one year. He might just turn up before Christmas and just, whatever, bring some Primark stuff and be like, yo, whatever. And I'm like, cool, I'm excited because I need to see my father. And then from the age of 8, when I moved to the States, I didn't really see him for 12 years, if anything, and then I came back to the UK, and then I saw him again, and I think, at the time when I was in university, I lived with him, and it was one of the most confusing experiences, because all of a sudden I've never had a father in my life. And this guy's trying to tell me, where you going? When are you coming back? I'm like, who are you, bro? Like, get out of here. So for me, I realized that my pain was so delayed because I never thought I didn't have a father. You know what I mean? Like, I knew that my father was over there, and I knew that he was still sort of married to my mother, but he just never turned up. He was never there. He didn't show up. So in my head, I was just like, I never really ever was in a conversation with people till like maybe when I was like late 20s, and saying, oh, I didn't grow up with my father, because like, yeah, I know my father. Like, he was always about, but like all my years from like when I was 3 to 20, I never had my father around. And those were some of the most formative periods in my life where I needed male guidance. I needed somebody to be there physically to tell me, to just, again, reassure me that I'm loved and I'm lovable, because again, that really fractured the relationship I had with my mother, because my mother, again, as most Black mothers do, they struggle to replicate the experiences and physical yeah, the physical representation of a man, because nobody can do that. A father cannot do that for a mother. Neither can a mother do that. And ultimately, because they struggle at that, they go overboard with the heaviness. So my mother was really trying to be very kind of, heavy-handed in the way she dealt with me and try to, whip me all the time with belts and stuff. And I was like, get out of here. So for me, I got massively tougher in that regard, because I was just like, that's all you got, just trying to whip me into shape. But actually, that ain't really, I've learned to be immune to that. So cool. Okay, I could take a couple licks. Good. Then I move on, because you ain't really trying to sort me out. So all of a sudden, I would reach out to I would kind of lean towards other male figures who were absolutely destructive in their lives, in the ways in which they live their lives. But for me, that's what I was yearning for, because I didn't have any male role models at home. So, people who were drug dealers, people who were hard in the streets, like I was like, okay, cool. I would just hang out with them, because I needed a male figure, and they knew that I needed that. So they try to use that void to kind of fulfill their own needs, which was to get a young kid who was going to do this for them or do that for them, or somebody who they could exploit and manipulate, to do various things for them, because they knew that I didn't have this male figure in my household. So for me, that was one of the most kind of, incredible learnings when I grew up older, to realize that, wow, I didn't actually realize that I didn't grow up with my father. And that's why all these things that I was doing when I was younger were my ways of trying to find a male role model in my life, because I didn't have one. So for me, that's basically the journey. And until today, the relationship I have with my father is incredibly fractured. Like, I like him as a regular dude. Like, he's cool. We can talk about sports. He's like one of the most, interesting thinkers that I know. But in terms of what the role of a father or caregiver is, he was absolutely unable to be that in any capacity. He cannot even remember my birthday. He doesn't even, I remember recently, like last year, I did this. I had an exhibition at the Mayor of London's office, and the Mayor of London wanted me to come in and do a speech about what it is that I do and speak on that. And I invited my father. That's the first thing I ever invited my father to. And I went on stage, absolutely destroyed the whole event. Everybody was just clapping for almost 2 minutes. I came off. My sisters was like, they came and gave me a hug saying, wow, man, you blew that away. And my father never said a word to me. Never said a word to me. I got featured in The Guardian the other day. And my father was like, yeah, like he saw the spread. And one thing he said was like, the only thing he said to me was like, oh, I didn't know that your project cost this amount to deliver. I'm like, oh yeah, it does. That's all. That's all he said to me. He never said one congratulating word, never said, man, I'm proud of you, none of that. And I realized at that moment that I still really wanted his approval. I still really needed him to say, son, I see you. You are lovable. I'm proud of you. He never said any of those words. And the way it impacted me, I was so shocked, because I didn't know that I still needed that at this age that I am. And that's how I know that it's one of the most impacting things that ever happened to me in my life, realizing that, my father's void was something that could never be filled, and really, really impacted my trajectory as a man, and how I'm still on learning and uncovering a lot of those impacts that it still had on me as a man.
I've said before that as children, we bear the sins of our parents, right? And you're right that there's just a biological, spiritual, mental, emotional yearning to have your father's approval. As I grew up, my mum only really congratulated me for my educational achievements, but that's very much the culture, If you do well educationally, that's when they're most proud of you. I can't imagine what it would have felt like for your dad to just go, son, I'm proud of you, And it's really hard as children. We have to learn to forgive our parents. And I say that's easier said than done. It's because it's true. There's no parent manual to how they raise us.
That's true.
And you know how much I can align with the idea of, and the truth that growing up with a single mother, your mother's more harsh on you, because my mother wanted to keep me so much on the straight and narrow that it almost gave her an anxiety and panic attack if she felt like I was doing something that was off. And I wish that if my dad was alive, I think my dad would have understood me a lot more, simply because a man aligns with a man. The same way us men, we can't understand everything a daughter goes through, but we can give her the best example of what a man could be, should be, or should aim to be when she goes up with a man or woman, whatever it might be. And I feel like the role of fathers is overlooked and underplayed in society. And whether that's due to the misandry in society, some people argue that many organizations such as Black Lives Matter, they want to dismantle the nuclear family. But I want to take the time to address that in many aspects, because what it is they don't. They want to expand the nuclear family under the premise of a child not embraced by its village will burn it down to feel its warmth.
Right.
I know that a child embraced by the village will ultimately grow up to be a powerful human. That's not to take away from the fact of how important a father is.
Right.
Band-aid to the long-standing issue within our community. What I think is so powerful is whenever I'm out on the street and I see a dad, you know, playing with his kids, I'm just like, rah. I always go, do you know how happy I am to see that? And he probably thinks, oh, this is just normal to me. But I'm just like, do you know how important this is for your kids? Do you know how important it is for your kids to know that you love them? How important it is for you to stay with your children? And it makes me emotional because I didn't have that. You know, I watch videos of fathers returning home from war. It gets to me because I'm like, I wish my dad would return home. Like, I miss my dad more than I miss anything else in this world. And it's just because I know he understood me. You know, I was sick. I don't remember a lot about him, but everyone tells me how much he loved me. Everyone tells me how much he cared for me. And for me to even understand that warmth is something that just so many young boys need. I went with my friend to American football training. I didn't partake in a training that day. And there was this kid, he was struggling, but he was strong. He kept up with the rest of the other kids. And at the end of the session, I went up to him and I said, bro, you did so damn well. You are strong. You are powerful. And you know, the kid said to me, really? I felt emotional, you know, because I'm like, this kid has probably never heard that. I'm like, wow, you're so talented. And I said, I actually mean it. I'm not trying to sweeten up your heart. I said, I genuinely believe you are talented. And he was like, really? I said, don't you believe in yourself? And he said, no, I don't. Do you know how many young boys feel like that? And then they project that out into the world. And I'm sure you know from rap music, especially in general, that the greatest way we get over our trauma is always with money. We always attribute it value of trauma with somehow there's an amount of money we can get to get over it. Do you know? And it exactly doesn't work like that, bro. No. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. I'm just listening to you, bro, because exactly everything you're saying just chimes very strongly with everything that it is that I believe, but also everything that I encounter working with these young boys, you know, because, you know, as I said, I work predominantly with a lot of 13-year-olds. And again, just coming out of those sessions every time and just realizing, wow, again, it's not shocking because I see myself in those boys because I recognize everything that they're going through in a particular way, realizing that, you know, these young boys are shut of self-esteem and confidence in themselves and their own abilities because their fathers, again, when we look at this, because I've always been interested in this conversation, and you know, a lot of people have always talked about the concept of, you know, the absent Black father and all that stuff. And for me, I you know, this idea that there's a mythology and that there is this, you know, over kind of monetization of this agenda. But ultimately, however we dress up the situation, evidentially and statistically, there's a lot of Black homes that are without father figures, but there is a myriad of reasons for this, which I don't believe is accounted for when this actual mythology is spoken about. Ultimately, people look at it and think it's only the doing of the Black man himself, and therefore he's the one that is at fault for the reasons why he's absent, as opposed to looking at the overall sociological constructions of what exists within the Black parenthood and the Black families that make it easier for Black males to be drawn to violence, or therefore, you know, needing to getting involved in things that may end up leading to the deaths of them or the destruction of the family in itself. So anyway, so realizing that most rooms that I'm in with 20 Black boys at a time, the percentage of boys in there without fathers is much higher than those who have fathers at home, and realizing that the impact this has on these young boys is so evident to see because I recognize that within me. You know, every time they do something or they say something and I, you know, I celebrate them, the shock in their faces and the shocks in their response is just like, really me? Like, I'm like, yeah, that's so incredibly inspiring to hear you say that, or I feel so proud of you that you did that. And he's just so shocked that anybody, especially a Black male, could recognize something in him that is not the idea of, oh, you just banged that guy up, man, that's your heart, you know, like recognizing elements of vulnerability. So when they open up, I just pause the room and say, man, that's so brave, man. Like, I'm so inspired by you. And he's just looking at me like, is he talking to me? You know, I'm like, yes, because I know that nobody's ever championed that element of your identity or yourself or being able, if anything, people have actually repudiated that version of yourself because that is seen as moist and wet and all of these other things. So yeah, so for me, you know, realizing that the idea of a male being in the environments where they are exposed to positive representations of a male in their lives consistently can never be understated. It's almost singularly one of the biggest I think specific interjections that exist in a child's life when you think about what trajectory they can go. You know, having a male role model that is positive, not just any male role model, that is positive in their lives, can really be the actual singular thing that could change that young person's trajectory from going down this particular pathway to the other. And for me, the older I get, the more I start to realize that is singularly one of the biggest, you know, factors that could really determine the outcomes of a young Black male in the society that we live in, for sure.
Absolutely. And whenever we think about fathers, you're right. There's so many other reasons why a lot of fathers aren't in children's lives. You know, I've spoken to some fathers and they've told me openly, they said they don't know how to be a father. And they've said the mother to their child doesn't understand that they don't know. And they're afraid to open up. And I could only imagine that. And what I'm not using on this podcast is justifying a man not being in his life. But there's sometimes wider reasons. A lot of men become scared. And I'm not saying that women should become rehabilitation centers for broken men in many other aspects. They've got their own work to do. But a lot of men are just simply afraid. They haven't had a father themselves. And I remember there was a really fantastic quote that said, 2 boys grew up with an alcoholic father. One of them became an alcoholic. And when asked the reasons why, he said, I watched my father. The other one didn't become an alcoholic. And the same reason he had was, I watched my father. Now, there's always 2 outcomes, right? But we have different responses. And we have different stimuli that we respond to. And I think people forget this all the time. You know, we're so harsh and we're so quick to kick sometimes men when they're down, you know, be like, you're this, you're that. But you're right. When was the last time a Black man heard, you're fantastic, man? Like, you're amazing. And you know, it's crazy when you said about the 2 Ethiopian boys when they hugged and said the picture face to face, because when my friend goes to hug me, he's a lover, man. He's soft. He's into music. That's all he's seen in his whole life. When he goes to hug me, I'm like, what are you doing, man? And I realized I had to sit down and reckon with myself. And I realized, do you know what? I don't like to be hugged. My mum didn't ever hug me that much. And when she did hug me, I used to ask, like, what do you want? And even as a result, when I go to hug my mum, she was like, what do you want? You know, coming from this, I don't like to use the word dysfunctional because it has such a heavy, anchoring, negative connotation to it. But I think there's no other word that I could use to describe it. It was dysfunctional, you know, and it made me realize as I grew up in life. Now, at 26, I'm trying to recognize my friends for the positive that they're doing. So I might say to my friend, yo, I thank you for coming and spending some time with me, man. I appreciate it. Or, thank you for, you know, being consistent. Thank you for not flaking on me. Thank you for just being communicative with me. Just those small things I've realized, Sean, that doesn't make you gay. That doesn't make you this. Share positive emotion. What is it about young Black men sometimes growing up that we are so attracted to that negative emotion? But as I've already said, we know we have that positive loop, right? That's one thing. But why is it negativity seems to sell more commercially, even within our community? Is it those remnants from slavery? Because, for example, we know that there was issues such as buck breaking, where the slaves used to rape Black men and you know, emasculate them in front of their families, and that broke up the Black home in ways that we could never imagine. There's all these different things that are happening, right? And I've written about this in a lot of my work and a lot of the work that I do. We've got to find a space for Black men and Black women to coexist harmoniously, and sometimes that's not always realistic, but where we can come together and have a conversation at the round table without people feeling attacked, without people feeling like, you know, nobody wants to listen to them. Why are we so attracted to the negative aspects compared to the positive aspects? Because think, for example, it's the first time we've ever had a conversation like, you know, via this, but we can find so much that we've been through, but we have found the positives out of that. Is it just a matter of time that we can get over the negativity, or is it something that comes with maturation as young Black men?
I mean, I don't think any of those two things are a given, that because of maturation or time, we would ultimately arrive at this destination that we both are, which is a consistent journey. Because I know men that are 60 years old or 70 years old or however old that are still infantile in their emotional development, still very young in the ways in which they express themselves, still yearn for, validation by other men as to how they are the man in the house, and they're 70 years old. And these are men that are still very much crippled by the patriarchal idea of masculinity. So for me, I don't believe time nor maturation as just bare virtue of just letting the years roll by would get us to that destination of being able to explore the positivities that we can explore to allow our development in masculinity to be much more positively fruitful. But I do believe what is important is, again, looking at the fact that this is a system that's built strategically for a reason, So therefore, when we look at, all just all of us, like, say, for example, and I don't want this to come out like, I am, bashing a particular type of music or whatnot, because, as creators, I think it's important that we express ourselves, but what we cannot not do is not be accountable for the outcomes that are for the most part directly or indirectly linked to what we put out there in the world. That's for sure. So again, I think about, a random drill artist could put a song out today. In 3 hours, it's probably got 1 million views.
Yeah.
A majority of the viewers are young men and young Black boys predominantly. But then counter to that, somebody else who makes music that's not drill, might put out a song equally incredible and probably has a big following themselves too. For example, somebody like J. Cole or whatever, or Kendrick could put out a song. They have huge followings. Their following does not, the music does not get the same kind of views, the same kind of reach as, say, for example, someone like 6ix9ine or whoever it is, anybody that makes music that is overtly exploring violence, gangsterism, drug trade, all of these things. So therefore, we know that the market is set up for that type of outcomes.
Yes.
The person who is more, gangster driven. I mean, I remember very vividly, I think in the early 2000s, the 50 Cent and the Kanye West, which almost were a very stark contrast of the types of masculinities that were being projected at the time. Kanye West was the, polo top, cashmere jumper wearing, light colored, and he spoke openly about how, he was always being laughed at and mimicked as a rapper. And then the complete opposite at the time was the 50 Cent, got shot, 9 times, hyper gangster, all of that imagery. And I remember those two were pit against each other when they brought out an album at a time. And it was a big thing because everybody was like, oh, who's going to sell more? Who's going to sell more? And that was almost a marker point for the versions of masculinities that have previously been created and ultimately, based on the formulas that existed, would always prevail, which was the 50 Cent version. And somebody like Kanye West coming out and almost going left field with it shocked everybody. And ultimately, what that highlighted was there was a lot of men that also wanted to see that version of themselves out there. But prior to that, there was no representation of it. So for me, understanding that the businesses that have existed in the entertainment industry, in the movie industry, in the fashion industry have been set up to capitalize on one version of masculinity. So therefore, men have always, again, we look at, music that held out of the Caribbean. Majority of it is a lot of it has been always entrenched in homophobic rhetoric.
Absolutely.
Things that, that only celebrate one version of masculine, which is the type that daggers any woman and just basically has all these girls that on call, has anything that he wants, drugs, gangsterism, weapons, but nothing about showing love to another male, nothing about representing a version of themselves that values loyalty, that values brotherhood, that values all these other things. So if everything that surrounds our popular culture growing up is only pointed in one direction, it's not a surprise that men do not have any other blueprint of what men should be. Because ultimately, the same way men have been missold these ideas, women are being missold these ideas of what men they should aspire to be with. because the men that they are told they should look out for are the men who protect them. They're the men who put money on the table. They're the men who do not let anybody disrespect them when they're out in a rave and, and another guy touches their butt, you know, because then he's just going to show up and just bang him. They're obviously attracted to men who are taller and bigger than them because they want to feel more protected and secure. So nothing is being told to girls about a man who's emotionally mature, a man who's able to open up and express his feelings and talk openly and honestly, a man who's able to express himself in the authenticity of his individuality. None of these things are given to women as things to aspire for if they are to be heterosexual females and attract men. It's all these other things which are being sold. So therefore, the society's created this match of what men should be and what women should aspire for. And nothing within that leaves room for a counter stereotypical idea of masculinity. And therefore, even if you aspire for that, the danger is then if you're heterosexual, there's no woman that's going to be taught to look out for that because you're not a match for them. So therein lies a lot of the challenges that have been created consciously by the society that we live in. And that's why it's such a big task and a big ask to try and figure out a way to resell a new idea to young boys growing up and men to aspire for within themselves, because there's no evidence of real rewards that come with that version of masculinity.
And you're right that we know that, for example, children and adults, they need positive rewards. They need whatever it is, it stimulates them, right? And as you said, for example, when you think about the Caribbean, the greatest export has been, you know, Bob Marley, reggae. But then you move on from that and you realize it's, for example, the culture we've been able to import. And that is with artists such as Popcorn, Movado, so much more. They've been able to break in Vibes Cartel. They broke the well, Popcorn, I think, out of all the Jamaican artists, has broken into the UK scene. You've seen them collaborating with individuals such as Lowski and so much more. But then now through the independent, you know, labels, as in people who are independent, free off a label, you have Chronics, you've got Coffee, who are starting to bring back that positivity, starting to bring back that love and that light. And in accordance with what you said, that there is such an incentive to bring out toxic music. And you see that even with a lot of women nowadays. Who am I to argue about Meg Stallion or Cardi B? Femininity is a whole nother conversation within itself. I think when it comes to us men, especially, the music we listen to is everything. The music, what you put in and what you put out. You know, you had the issues with Rick Ross where he brought out the song and he had a lyric, what was it? Pop a Molly and I'm sweating, or put a date rape drink in her drug and put a date rape drug in her drink. All these things contribute to why men seem to feel a certain kind of way. And again, all of this performative masculinity, all the ways that we see this, right? So just how impactful have you seen your work has become in addressing, you know, these toxic stereotypes to men or to young boys growing up and becoming men?
Bro, I mean, I take that that's a life goal for me, and it's a life purpose. I take it so seriously because I know that, you know, it's a life and death situation, life and death for boys, either in the physical death or the psychological, emotional death of men, period. And I know that for me, the job that I do with young boys and ultimately men at large is so massive, you know, the responsibility. And, you know, working with young boys year in, year out, week in, week out, and seeing how they emote. I mean, the first week I have something called a mood box, which I create, and I get these young boys every day when I come into the session every week to write how they feel. They're not allowed to write one word. They're only allowed to elaborate on a point. So the first few things when I come into the session, when I first meet them, on the paper, they write calm, cool, drippy, chill, pissed. And I'm like, I'm not going to take that. You need to elaborate. Why do you feel pissed today? Who's pissed you off? What's the emotion behind it? You know, good. What does good mean? Tell me, why do you feel happy or good or whatever it is? Because these are language that boys are not even given to be able to articulate or express themselves. They don't even know. They struggle for the first few weeks to think of how to even elaborate on a point. You know, because I'm like, good is a mask word. It doesn't tell what the emotion inside is.
Exactly.
You know, and that's why for boys, frustration, all these other emotions that they are allowed to have, and anger, they don't have more ways to express that. So ultimately, if somebody steps on them or somebody violates them or makes them look like, you know, unique, they can articulate that in ways that doesn't resort to violence, but because they do not have these tools. The first thing they want to do is just bang him because they're embarrassed. They feel shame. They cannot say these words. So instead of actually finding ways to articulate the emotion, they just think, well, the only language I have is violence. So I'm just going to go and hit this guy because then I cannot actually speak about it. People are laughing at me. I cannot articulate these emotions. So for me, one of the biggest tools is trying to empower boys with the tools to emotionally be literate. And working with these young boys for 8 weeks, it's almost so incredible all the time, just seeing the range of emotional development that's happening in these boys' lives. The ability to be able to, articulate themselves and understand themselves in ways that they probably didn't have a conducive environment to nurture. Seeing these young boys form healthy togetherness within a group of other 19 Black boys in a room that they might see around in the school, but actually are able to articulate how they feel within that group and not feel ashamed, to be able to see themselves not as an op, because again, I speak very explicitly about the system that's created this idea that we look at ourselves as our own enemies. So a young boy that's, I don't know, from a particular council estate in Hackney goes off ends in the next place, he might see a white guy walk past. He's not going to look around and say that guy's my op. Exactly. But the next Black guy that's wearing a tracksuit bottom that looks exactly like him, that's the guy he's looking out for. That's the guy that he thinks wants him dead. That's the guy that he thinks wants to G-check him. And that idea has been portrayed and sold to us that we look at ourselves as our own enemies. And I do not buy into this idea of Black on Black crime, but we do understand that there are these intersecting ideas that pervade race in terms of how we look at ourselves as our own enemy, and race being a common denominator. But outside of that, there's a lot of other factors, socioeconomically, poverty, all these other elements, which make it not just a Black on Black situation. It's just a situation around our own psychological idea of ourselves as aggressors, as dangerous, as nothing but negative. So again, allowing these young boys to deconstruct that idea of looking at themselves as lovable, therefore looking at another Black boy as somebody that they can love without feeling like that makes them gay, without feeling like that makes them soft or that makes them moist, to actually look at each other in a positive way, as opposed to looking at somebody as they're up. So really for me, working with these young boys over an 8-week period, helping them uncover all these ideas that are so insidiously planted in our existence of ourselves, and allowing them to create positive, harmonious relationships between boys that look like them, allowing them to identify the range of emotions that they have the rights to feel, allowing them to think about alternative ways for conflict resolution that do not result in violence, allowing them to provide an opportunity to feel lovable without thinking that that's not something that is afforded to people that look like them. So for me, I see all these things, some in a very tangible way that I can account, but there's a lot that is just anecdotal examples that I can give from now to tomorrow that are not quantitative, that can show the impact of how these programs have radically changed young boys' lives from now to hopefully when they are old enough to start to, bring other children into the world if they choose to do that, so they can carry on this continual mindset shift that is happening at this stage in their lives. That's the hope that I have, for sure.
Absolutely. And you're right. Sometimes emotions can't be quantified. However, the world we're moving into, technology will soon start to quantify it. And I can only imagine the reality that you're able to perpetuate for these children is so far outside of their own. It must feel like a Marvel universe in many other aspects. I've gone to schools and alongside 2 other Black boys, we used to go and teach these children, right? And if I could tell you, when we used to walk into the classroom, I had cane rows. So in many aspects, I probably looked like a pretty boy, right? These kids, automatically, they would listen. A lot of them were Black. They were white students, 2 Asian students. But the classroom would fall deaf when we would start teaching. And we're teaching them with this passion and this vigor that a lot of teachers aren't able to manifest, perhaps maybe because the education system has stifled their once dreams that they had, and it's now become a job in which they get paid. And we're teaching them about race, education, and music. So we're talking and exploring for them Grandmaster Flex and exploring the concept of cream and how cash rules everything around me, breaking down hip hop, breaking down education, and breaking down the racial aspects. For example, the war on drugs. These kids, they're so engaged at the end of the session. Kids are like, sir, can you can you come back, please? Even recently, I saw a girl that recognized me from class. I was sitting down in Shoreditch with my friend, trying to charge my phone. And she was like, I remember you. You came to my school one time and taught a project. And I was like, at first I didn't recognize her. Like, wait, I recognize you now. Do you know how powerful that is? What I did sat with that child for the rest of her life. And imagine the work you're doing with young boys, showing them an alternative way to be a man, to be masculine. That's going to sit with them for the rest of their life. They're going to remember that. And as you said, when you're catching them at 13, that psychological foundation that's going to take them through manhood is going to sit with them. They're always going to remember you for the work that you are doing. I'm so thankful there's individuals like yourself who are doing the groundwork, the grassroots work that needs to be done. And you've been so open and you've been so transparent with me. We've even gone well over my usual podcast time, but I am more than happy with that, because I believe anyone who's going to be listening to this is going to walk away empowered, invigorated, and with a new sense of self, especially for the young boys that are listening. Tell me a little bit more. Take me through the journey of what you've created and just how have you seen yourself change from the beginning to now?
Great. I mean, yeah, again, I just want to say I feel super honored to be on this platform and just to be able to speak openly about these things with somebody who I believe is absolutely mirroring the same feeling, emotion, and energy. And I think that just makes for incredible listening, I believe, for those who do decide to tune in. So for me, I think the Smiling Boys project was initially, a brainchild of mine in 2018 initially, because at that stage was when we started to hear about, on a political level anyway, about the increase in youth violence, predominantly speaking about it from a racialized term, knife crime, which is a very racialized term. And ultimately, a lot of the statistics that were being provided at that time was very much skewed towards Black boys being victims and perpetrators. So for me, hearing a lot of the discourse on that level, most of the solutions were, criminal justice informed. Most of it was increased criminalization, more police in minority ethnic communities, even some conversations about police in schools, hearing about, all those types of angles of dealing with the problem. Nothing was from a public health approach. Again, being an artist and somebody who had worked for a long time with young people, specifically Black boys, across different elements of the society, working in prisons, working with young people in gangs and young people in mainstream education and people referral units. So I knew that, okay, here comes a time that I now need to create the solution that I need to see, because nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about how to create something that is based upon a holistic approach that is driven from a public health perspective. So for me, I decided to write, as I said, that year I wrote 38 applications for the program, because I knew that I wanted to conduct some research first about what it takes for a person to be happy. Because when we look at the statistics and we look at, the crime rates and especially, serious youth violence in particular communities, we have to look at all the factors that make it conducive for violence to be a go-to for these young Black boys. It's not because they were born and just want to be animals and savages and carry knives. So we have to look at what are the factors that are used to make somebody happy? And how can I use this to design a program that allows for these young people to go through a process of uncovering so many things that inevitably would lead to their increased levels of happiness, which inevitably would reduce violence. Because we know that prisons do not reduce reoffending. We know that people who go into prisons do not become less violent. We know that people who go into people referral units are inevitably going to go into prisons. We know that young people who go through a care system are more likely to end up in prison. So therefore, we know that all these other things that have been put in place as a society's response to increased violence is not equaled a reduction in violence. It's only fed the capitalist system, which is there to profit off of these violence that exist in our society anyway. So for me, that was the moment that I decided I wanted to conduct research, and then to use this research to design a robust program which was artistically driven. So I eventually got funded after applying for the 38 grants by the Wellcome Trust, which allowed me to travel to some of the happiest countries in the world to ethnographically research what it means to be happy in these environments. So I, went to Denmark, went to Sweden, went to a lot of other Scandinavian countries which register in the top 5 happiest countries. I also went to Bhutan, which is the only country that measures gross national happiness instead of GDP.
Yes.
So I went to these different countries. I interviewed scientists that conduct the research around happiness. I went to the Happiness Research Institute, which is based in Copenhagen in Denmark. And I interviewed the CEO and all these other people. And what I came back with was 8 indicators that are used to measure happiness. And the 8 indicators were then used to design each week for one indicator of happiness, to empower these young people using creative tools to explore how these individual indicators can be used to boost their own happiness, which ultimately would increase their attainment in school, which would ultimately improve their mental well-being, and ultimately would reduce any inclination to a serious youth violence. So these 8 pillars were: the first was trust, the second is togetherness and belonging, the third is money, the fourth is freedom, security, purpose, health, physical and mental, and balance. So all of these were then used to design programs that allowed for me to use creative tools like photography, poetry, film with these young people, and giving them these tools. So I give them cameras to go into their neighborhoods and photograph who they trust and who they don't trust, or areas they trust and areas they don't trust, and to explore, annotate why. And then they bring it back into the classroom. We have discussions and they debate that. I give them opportunity to write who are the people that they spend time with, and what are the positive outcomes from that, and what are the negative outcomes that come from some of the people they spend time with, to write prose form, poetry, rap, whatever it is that they feel motivated to explore these themes with. I give them the tools and empower them to explore and express these things. And ultimately, all these 8 pillars, every week I use artistic tools to allow these young people to uncover and explore these themes of themselves in their everyday lives. And then we have a discussion, we have debates about these things. And on the 8th week, I then take these young boys on a trip to an art institution. Ultimately, I get them to ethnographically explore what does it feel as Black boys in an environment that is completely colonial and white supremacist in a structure. How do they feel as Black boys, 20 of them, in a space like the Tate? How do they feel with the way people police their bodies in those spaces? The art that they see, how do they feel about how that does not reflect them in those spaces? And then ultimately we have a debrief, we explore that, I photograph them in that space, I empower them to be photographed against colorful backdrops, which is counter stereotypical to how they always represent themselves.
Yeah.
So as part of the process, the culmination point is being able to get to the point where they're able to show this version of themselves to the world, a version that they never have ever felt safe enough to be able to show of themselves. Most of the time, they have a default look, which is the mean mug, the screw face, the hoodie up, the gang fingers. That's how they represent themselves. So here I am challenging them to smile. And the first things they do is, like, when I show them the images of previous boys, when I go into the sessions, they say, "Who is this? That's gay, sir. You never get me taking pictures like this." But on the 8th week, these are the same boys that allow themselves to let go of these shackles of their versions of themselves that they've always known, to represent a version that is more authentic to who they genuinely are. Maybe the people that are closest to them are the only people that ever see that version of themselves. But that's the visual that, for me, is devoid in our society. Because if people saw Black boys and Black men like this, we will have less Mark Duggans, we will have less Leon Bridges, we will have less George Floyds, because people will not see Black boys and Black men inherently as aggressors, dangerous, victims and perpetrators of crime. Instead, they'll see a humanized version of Black ideas and Black identities, which we all see in the environments that we grew up. But that's not what the society portrays as Black boys when we look at media representation, newspapers, and political discourses that surround Black boys and Black identities.
Absolutely. And through the work you've been able to do, the fact you've been able to travel all across the world in many aspects, and Bhutan, I've heard about it. Yeah, they measure their GDP in terms of happiness. That tells you a lot. And I want to do a bit more research into them. And I was saying to Kay off camera that I'm looking forward to collaborating with him and doing some work, because this is the kind of collaborative energy we need to have. People need to put their money where their mouth is, and also put their efforts where they should be. Absolutely. Projects like the one you're doing, it's revolutionary in the aspects that people do not realize it. I'm sure it will take sometimes people to miss the water until the well runs dry for them to realize the work that you are doing. I've got to ask you as one of my final questions, right? Because we have gone so far. Like I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm gonna definitely need to have you on for a part 2. So everyone that's listening, this is not just part 1. We're gonna be able to do more parts because I generally see collaborative work happening with Kay right now. I want to ask you, right? What does the future hold for the Smiling Boys project, and where would you like to see the Smiling Boys project in a few years' time?
Wow, that's a great question, and I'm at a very important cusp right now, in that the demand for the program has surpassed the supply. Because so far I'm the only artist that delivers the program. I design it and I deliver it at the moment. So, you know, and each program is, the model is I deliver the program for 8 weeks in a school, and I work with 20 Black boys at a time. So in 5 days, which are the 5 days in a week, at the moment, I'm in 9 schools in 5 days, which is, you know, a huge juggling act. So what I'm planning on doing is, and what we're working on doing at the moment is, you know, upskilling some young Black boys to start to shadow and start to train them to start to become facilitators in the near future. I also, I'm working on developing an alumni program that seeks to continually provide the opportunity for these young boys to carry on the work that we started together in the 8 weeks, and for them to start to be upskilled, to receive mentorship online by myself and other incredible Black artists and Black males. And then obviously provide them with opportunities in the long term through partnerships with other institutions, corporates, and partnerships that allow for these young people to get access to internships, to paid employment in the long term. Also, I'm working on trying to deliver design the Smiling Girls Project, because what has come into light in the last year and a half as I've, you know, delivered this program and received great levels of success with the program. A lot of girls and a lot of people is like, man, we need one for the girls. And I'm like, that's important, but it's not going to be led by me, because the reason why the Smiling Boys Project is so powerful is because I represent a visual representation of what these boys are. They see themselves in me. And I believe it's important that for the Smiling Girls program that I work with a Black artist that can, you know, we can replicate a lot of the findings, the best practice from the Smiling Boys and the Smiling Girls program that allows for the girls to also see themselves in an incredibly powerful Black female or you know, non-binary female identifying artist that is able to provide the same kinds of impacts and outcomes that the Smiling Boys has. So that those are the you know, short, medium, long-term goals and ideas for the program, to kind of scale up the Smiling Boys project a little bit, and then to start building and designing the Smiling Girls project, which hopefully should be ready for the end of 2021/early 2022.
Talk about projecting into the future. Just as you have spoken about the future, I genuinely believe, as I said, that these people will never be able to forget you in their future. And you've evidently left a token, a seed, you know, a magic bean into their present that will ultimately grow. You're allowing young men to see themselves emotionally literate, emotionally mature. And I feel emotionally empowered coming out of this conversation, as I'm sure so many of you listeners have been able to as well. I have thoroughly is actually an understatement. I ultimately have felt a sense of emotional relief, and in many senses this conversation has felt therapeutic to me, to know that there's another brother out there who is doing the work that needs to be done. And as I said, everyone who knows me, you know that I want to put the work in. So this is the kind of project I'm definitely going to collaborate on. I want to work on a piece with you to get your coverage up as well, bro, so people can do great things for you and by you. Also as well, how can people support your project?
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that's firstly teachers and senior leaders in the education sphere. You know, the more of schools and teachers that I have who are keen partners would always be great, you know, because as I said, I received some funding to work in certain boroughs in London. So being able to establish partnerships in those schools would be great. So, you know, boroughs, I mean, all boroughs in London, you know, is what, you know, I'm open to having partnership with. Also, you know, outside of the school, in terms of partners, any corporates that, you know, are really interested in doing this real work and really want to support a program or support an incredible, set of amazing Black boys, it's always, I'm always open to those type of partnerships. I have a crowdfunder on my social platforms, so Smiling Boys Project page or Smiling Boys Podcast page, where you can support that as well directly from a monetary perspective. And again, just to continually amplify the project and the work that is being cascaded through the project, and to engage in conversations with boys and men and other females as well, and non-binary folk in your life, and challenge some of these themes that are explored in the program, so that we can create a much more healthier idea of masculinity and gender in the world that we're hoping to create moving forward.
Wow. Honestly, I feel speechless, because the only word I can take away is emancipatory, liberatory, revolutionary, and futuristic. Okay. What an absolute honor. I feel privileged to have you on my platform to share the energy you have just been able to put out there. If people have not felt the energy now, then I don't know what, because it's just the significance of what you're doing. The future will only be the test of time to tell how much you have done. I'm so happy we've been able to connect. Absolutely, thoroughly on it. Oh God, I don't know what word to describe. Like, we've spoken from the light of the day until the darkness.
I know, bro. That's actually crazy.
It's absolute. Like, people know me that I usually don't like doing things that are quite long, but my podcasts have changed my mindset so much. And if I didn't do the podcast that I've done, I wouldn't have been exposed to an individual such as yourself. Even I have to give a big thanks to Josephine for exposing me to the work that you have done as well. Like, I've got to give her such a big shout out, because
big love.
Love and energy manifests itself in a myriad of ways. And I believe the future is safe and it is optimistic with individuals doing what you're doing in schools.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. And likewise, your platform, being able to cascade, the amazing myriad of thoughts and, knowledge that you share on your platform is you take that responsibility very seriously. And I, as a fan, as just somebody that is privy to your page, as you highlighted through Josephine and her connection to us, I've continually been, inspired, and just always feel so empowered and feel as, hopeful and optimistic as you, by listening to the things that you share and the conversations that you navigate on your platform as well. Because I think, that's the type of men that I believe the world moving forward need more of, and we need to continually just be empowered and emboldened by the purpose that drives the work that we do. And that is so evident every time I listen to you on your platform as well. So thank you, brother, for all the work that you do. And I feel so honored to have been on the platform here with you today as well.
Listen, I'm full of smiles, because it's so lovely to have two brothers that can share emotions and feelings and feel no type of way about this. And I hope this conversation is the blueprint for so many other brothers out there to share their happiness and their joy, their pleasure and their amazement with their other brothers out there who are doing great things. And just to also remind the man them in your life, or the brotherhood you have, or the young boys or the nephews or the cousins or anybody, that they are loved,
absolutely,
they are lovable, and they are enough. Okay.
Yes, brother.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you for having me, brother. Have a lovely
care.
rest of the week. All right. Bye. Peace.